Hello everyone, I am Victoria Carter. Welcome to History 222, or Survey of American History 2. Today we're going to dive into one of the most fascinating and contradictory decades in American history, the 1920s. 1920 to 1929, known as the Roaring Twenties. This era is often remembered for jazz, flappers, fast cars, and economic boom. But was it really all glitter and gold, or was something darker brewing beneath the surface? Perhaps a silent crisis? Let's explore both sides. After World War I, America exploded into change. The 1920s saw urbanization, industrial growth, and the rise of consumer culture. Skyscrapers pierced the sky. Radios brought music and news into millions of homes. It felt like the future had arrived. The 1920s also saw unprecedented economic growth. Following World War I, the U.S. economy rebounded quickly, fueled by mass production, rising consumer demand, and technological innovations. Henry Ford's assembly line revolutionized manufacturing as well. Automobiles became affordable. By 1927, the Ford Model T cost just $229. Other industries followed closely behind. Radios, refrigerators, washing machines, they all became household staples. Credit and installment buying also surged, encouraging Americans to buy now, pay later. Wall Street flourished. The stock market more than doubled between 1925 and 1929. But was this growth sustainable? Culturally, the decade was electric. The jazz age exploded with artists like Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington, redefining American music. Women gained new freedoms. The 19th Amendment gave them the right to vote in 1920, and the iconic flapper symbolized a break from Victorian traditions. At the same time, urbanization accelerated. By 1920s, more Americans lived in cities than on farms for the first time ever. City life brought dance halls, movie theaters, and nightlife. Hollywood boomed, and the first talking film, The Jazz Singer, premiered in 1927. But not everything was to be celebrated with these changes. Beneath the energy of optimism and the energy, cultural division deepened. Immigration sparked fierce debates. The Emergency Quota Act of 1921 and the Immigration Act of 1924 severely limited arrivals from Southern and Eastern Europe, revealing rising nativism. The Emergency Quota Act of 1921 was a U.S. immigration law that limited the number of immigrants allowed to enter the country each year from any given nation to 3% of the people from that country already living in the U.S., based off the 1910 census. The Immigration Act of 1924, also known as the Johnson-Reed Act, further restricted immigration. It lowered the national origin quota to 2% and was based on the 1890s U.S. Census, which favored immigrants from Northern and Western Europe. It also effectively banned immigration from Asia, reflecting the era's widespread nativism and racist attitudes. Meanwhile, the Ku Klux Klan reemerged, but this time not just in the South, it was nationwide. By 1925, its membership had reached over 4 million. There was still some good. The Harlem Renaissance was a cultural, artistic, and intellectual movement from the 1920s and 1930s, centered in Harlem neighborhood of New York City. It celebrated African American cultural expression and identity through music, literature, art, and performance, helping to lay the foundation for future civil rights activism. For African Americans, the Harlem Renaissance was a cultural high point, but life in much of the country remained segregated and violent. Racial violence continued, like the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921, which left hundreds dead and destroyed a prosperous black community. Over 2 days, hundreds of black residents in Tulsa, Oklahoma were killed or injured, thousands were left homeless, and dozens of city blocks were destroyed by fires by a white mob, making it one of the worst incidents of racial violence in U.S. history. One of the most iconic cultural clashes of the decade was between modern science and traditional religion. In 1925, the Scopes trial was a landmark legal case in Dayton, Tennessee, where teacher John Scopes was prosecuted for teaching Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, which violated the state's Butler Act banning the teaching of evolution in public schools. The trial featured 2 famous lawyers, Clarence Darrow for the defense and Williams Jennings Bryan for the prosecution, and it became a national spectacle symbolizing the clash between science and religion. Scopes was found guilty and fined, but the trial sparked a lasting debate about academic freedom and the separation of church and state in American education. The 18th Amendment launched prohibition in 1920, which banned the sale of alcohol. The goal was for a moral uplift and for social reform, but the result was actually the opposite. Speakeasies, which were illegal bars or clubs that operated during Prohibition, popped up across the country, and bootlegging became a major industry. Criminal empires, most famously Al Capone's in Chicago, made millions and corrupted law enforcement. Ironically enough, despite his criminal empire, Capone was actually ultimately convicted of tax evasion in 1931 and sentenced to prison, including time at Alcatraz. Prohibition arguably did more to undermine respect for the law than to curb drinking, and in 1933 it was repealed. While urban Americans enjoyed prosperity, rural areas struggled. During World War I, farmers expanded production to meet demand. But after the war, prices collapsed. Rural Americans faced falling incomes, rising debt, and increasing foreclosures. Unlike cities, which saw innovation and excitement, much of rural America was left behind. This agricultural depression foreshadowed the wider economic crash that lay ahead. So let's take a quick break for a controversial question. Was the 1920s truly a golden era of prosperity, or a dangerously unstable one? On the pros, you have economic boom, cultural innovation, women's rights, and urban growth. On the cons, you have racial violence and nativism, rural depression, political corruption, and organized crime. The tension between progress and instability defined the decade. The decade ended in disaster. On October 29, 1929, Black Tuesday occurred. The stock market crashed. Panic selling caused stock prices to collapse, wiping out billions of dollars in wealth and triggering a severe global economic downturn. It marked the beginning of the Great Depression. The crash revealed that much of the 1920s economy was built on speculation and fragile credit. Within 3 years, unemployment soared to 25%. Banks failed and closed. Bread lines replaced the dance halls. And the Roaring Twenties ended, not with a whisper, but a crash. So, how should we remember the 1920s? Was it a decade of dazzling progress or dangerous illusions? It was a time of great change. There was women's rights, jazz music, consumer goods, and cultural creativity all flourished. But it was also a time of inequality, cultural conflict, and the economy was fragile. The truth is, the Roaring Twenties were both a time of celebration and a silent crisis in the making. And understanding that complexity helps us better understand not only the past, but how sudden change can shape the future. Thank you for joining me today to talk about the Roaring Twenties. I look forward to next time.